Hey y'all, Melissa here with you today, and today's tutorial is about color blocking. Color blocking is the technique of using different colors or different fabrics for different parts of a pattern to create contrast and interest. And there are different ways to do it, and we're going to go over some of those different ways today. The first way to color block, and the easiest, is an example of what I'm wearing here. And all you have to do is cut out different pieces of the pattern from different types of fabric. So as you can see, I'm wearing a raglan sleeved shirt here, and I've got all the pattern details below. And on this pattern, I cut the sleeves out of a different fabric than I used for the body. And that's creating this color blocking contrast with this print and this solid. That is the easiest way to color block. And you can do that in all types of ways. For example, on this hoodie pattern, you could cut out the pocket in a different color. You could do the cuffs and the hem in a different color. Actually, I've done that back here. So I've got different colored cuffs and a different colored hem on this one. All of those are options for very simple color blocking that requires no pattern alteration. But what if you want to alter the pattern and add seams to color block where there were no seams before? Well, that's what I've done on this one. So as you can see, this is actually hacked from the same pattern as this, which is a hoodie pattern that I have a link to below. And in this version, I wanted to add this zipper neck. And I also wanted to color block to add this seam across the chest. So all I did to the pattern is I literally drew a line across the pattern where I wanted the color blocking for the top and the bottom to be. And then I added a seam allowance for the top part and for the bottom part. I'm going to show you what that looks like on here. So on this pattern here, all I did to color block that one is I drew a line where I wanted the color blocking seam to go. And then for the bottom half, we added a seam allowance this way, so it was extended this way on that side. For the top, I added a seam allowance that extended this way. And then I just sewed those together, and it was like working with the normal front piece again. I want to talk about proportion with color blocking because that can be tricky sometimes, like where do you draw that line? And I find that the rule of thirds is pretty helpful with this. So as you can see, this is a scale pattern piece here, and the scale piece is just over 5.5 inches. If I was to divide that into thirds, it would be approximately 1 3/4 inches. So as you can see, that's about how much of a line, or how much of this center line down the front is 1/3. And then I've got 2/3 below the line. And that is generally a pleasing proportion on a lot of people. You can do quarters, you can do half and half, but even numbered proportions tend to be trickier to look good on people than odd numbers, which is why I like the rule of thirds. If you do a 1/3, 2/3 kind of color blocking, you almost can't go wrong with that. Now, just because I drew a line straight across here, that doesn't mean that that's the only place you could do it. So for example, let's say I wanted to create an illusion of a thinner silhouette in the front. So I wanted to do that by using a light colored fabric down the main part of the body and then darker panels on the sides. How would I do that? So here on this pattern piece, I might do something like cutting in that line and then adding this panel. I might even eliminate this side seam and like make a little U-shaped piece for where it joins to the front, and then cut this out of a lighter fabric and this one out of a darker fabric. You could even curve it. I'm going to freehand this, but maybe you wanted it to look like this to make it more of kind of an hourglass shape, and you wanted to cut all of this out of a darker fabric. You can do that. You just add the line where you want, add the seam allowances on either side of it to the correct pieces, and then you retrace those pattern pieces and cut them out of your different fabric. Now these designs that I'm showing, these are symmetrical designs. So it's going to look the same on the right and the left. But what if I want an asymmetrical design? Like say I want stripes that run from my shoulder down towards my hip and use that as a color blocking pattern. Well, you might think that you would just draw a line like this. The problem with this is though, this is not going to end up with a stripe that runs across. It will end up with a stripe that runs to here, but if you flip this over, you'll notice that the stripe goes from that center back up towards the other shoulder. That's symmetrical. It is not the asymmetrical stripe that you want it going across the whole body. So how do you get those types of stripes? What you would do is you would want to trace out one side of your pattern, including that center line, flip your pattern over and trace the other side of it. When you do that, you would end up with a pattern that looks like this. So this is the full front, like what it looks like when it's unfolded. And now I can draw my stripes. So let's say this is what I wanted my final shirt to look like. Let me cut this apart and then we will show you how you would trace each pattern piece and where to add the seam allowances. And I'm adding these little tick marks just so I can keep them in order and I know which stripes go together with each other. You know what, I'm even going to add numbers here. That'll help me keep it straight. So here's the first pattern piece. And because I traced a pattern piece that already has seam allowances included, I only need to add a seam allowance to the additional line I drew. All right, so here's pattern piece 1. Stripe number 1. I need to add a seam allowance on each side because those are both seams that I have added to this. But I do not need to add seam allowances to the sides or the shoulder edge because those were already done. And that is what my number 1 stripe pattern piece would look like. And if I wanted to notch it to help match it with that one, I would add a notch here and here. And on this pattern piece, my notch would be here. So you can see how those would join together again. I would just repeat the process with the remaining pieces, adding seam allowances where I added lines to this. Now, let's talk a little bit more advanced color blocking than this, which is what I did on this shirt. So this particular color blocking is based on a shirt that Lana Condor wore in the movie P.S. I Still Love You, which was part 2 of To All the Boys I've Loved Before on Netflix. And when I saw her wearing this sweatshirt, I thought that was a really cool color blocking idea and I wanted to make one for myself. So I started with this ivory colored fleece and then I hand dyed fabrics for the other colors for myself. And I noticed from looking at the one she wore in the movie that this typical dropped shoulder seam on a sweatshirt was brought in almost to her actual shoulder point. So that was the first modification that I made on the pattern. This black line here was the original pattern and the red is where I started drawing my own lines. I measured up approximately 1/3 of the way on that shoulder line to where I wanted to bring in the pink part of this sweatshirt close to my actual shoulder. And then I redrew a line curving it down to a little bit below the arm side here. I actually wish I had gone even lower than what I did on this pattern piece because as you can see, there's just a teeny little bit of ivory under the arm side here. But this is how I did it. And then I noticed that this coral piece on the sleeve was kind of a flat cap. So this wasn't the original sleeve from the pattern I was using. I actually took this shoulder seam and I extended it out. You can see there. And that meant I had to modify the sleeve piece as well. So this amount that I extended out, I dropped the cap of the sleeve that amount. Essentially what I did is this piece of the sleeve kind of got stuck on to this piece of the pattern. So this is the coral piece, and again, I was using my proportions. This is about 1/3 of this length of the remaining sleeve, not with the cap there, but 1/3 to 2/3 proportions there. And I did this part for the coral and this part was gonna be the wine. So I cut all of these apart and then added seam allowances, and here is what my final pattern pieces modified look like. I had a front and a back, and I had added seam allowances to what was the pink part of this. And then the ivory part, I added the seam allowance along the curve. I didn't need to add seam allowances on the side seams, on the shoulder, any of that, because I was working off a pattern that already had seam allowances. And then here's what I did for the sleeve. I had to add a seam allowance where I cut the coral part apart from the wine part. On the final sweatshirt, I didn't do anything different to the hood piece, the pocket piece, or the hemband or cuffs. I just cut those out of the appropriate colors. And I actually cut all of my ivory fabric on this out first, and then I dyed the pieces that I needed in very small batches. So I just had these 2 coral pieces that I dyed. I dyed all the pink, that was actually a big batch. And then I dyed the cuffs and the lower parts of the sleeves in another batch. And that is how I put this sweatshirt together. Once you have done pattern modifications, basically you just sew the pieces together so that you end up with the same pattern pieces that you would have had if you'd cut it all out of the same fabric without these extra seams you added. So I sewed the ivory to the front and the back first, and I sewed the coral to the wine on the sleeves, and then I sewed the fronts to the backs, etc. One tip I will give you if you're doing some kind of advanced, involved color blocking like this is to baste your pieces together before you do your final stretch stitch pass, because stretch stitches can be very hard to pick out, and you want to make sure that you have nice joins between those color blocks. So I did a lot of basting on this sweatshirt when I put it together. You can see here, for example, I wanted to make sure that there was a nice match between the pink and the ivory at this joint. And then there's a lot more under the arm in this seam. So I wanted to make sure there was a nice join here with the coral and the wine colors, and here with the ivory and the coral and pink. This was actually the most complicated little area to do, and that is one of the reasons why I wish I had gone down further with the ivory pattern piece. So I basted those together, and then once I was sure that they were matching up, then I went and put them through my serger and sewed them together. I also added some top stitching where I joined them. So this is just a stretch stitch done on my regular sewing machine. And I did that to sew the seam allowances down so there aren't seam allowances on the inside. They're like sticking up willy-nilly and, you know, scratching against my skin because they're seams in odd places. So on the sleeves, I did stitch all of those down and with top stitching. So that is the story of how I made this hoodie. It was just some alteration of pattern pieces and then sewing the color blocked pieces together really carefully to make sure that I had matching of the colors along different seam lines. If you like this hack and you want to look at more hacks for this hoodie pattern, I have a whole playlist linked here that you can check out. And there's all kinds of different things that you can do with this really basic pattern to spice it up, mix it up, and get a look that is entirely your own.